So the things that I want to share have been on my mind for the last several weeks, and they're going to be somewhat connected, but the main thing that I want to talk to you guys about is to look at how Jesus interacted with sinners, the people around him. Some weeks, when I've put together a message for youth group or Hopper or Sunday morning, that's informative. Like there's things that I want you to learn. This is a week where my goal would rather be to remind us, to recenter us onto the nature of our Savior. So as Christians, we are called to be little Christs, mini Christs. We represent him, to reflect him wherever we go. And there are so many messages coming at us from all directions, telling us all these different ways to live and to act and to talk. And so I want to take just a little piece, and look at how Jesus interacted with the world around him. Now, to do that, I want to give a little bit of historical background. Some of you may have just died inside hearing that. The purpose is not just so that I can wax eloquent on history, although I would love doing that, but my purpose is to show how a number of the groups that we see in the New Testament show up. So whether you've noticed it or not, the world of the Old Testament and the world of the New Testament are vastly different. In the Old Testament, you have characters like the king. The king's kind of an important character. You have the priests, and they're doing their sacrifice stuff in the temple, and then you've got the prophets running around saying crazy things. So you have these characters. These are the main players in the Old Testament. But then in the New Testament, the king doesn't really play much of a part. The king's usually one of the bad guys. You don't have prophets so much running around, and the priests maybe are there, but they're a tertiary part of the story. You do have these groups instead that have taken their place. You have characters like the Pharisees and the Sadducees. You have characters like the Zealots mentioned. And if we don't pay attention, we might just bleep over these names. Be like a historical fiction that you read and the names are so long that you just kind of bleep over them and continue with the story. So let's share. So how do we have a difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament world? So the Old Testament story ends on mostly a negative note. 2 years ago, we read through the whole Bible in a year, and the story of the Old Testament ends with the people of Israel rebelling continually against God, and so they are taken into captivity in Babylon. So the temple is destroyed, the Jerusalem that has been wrecked, and the people are sold into captivity in Babylon. Okay, they're not there for forever. 70 years later, they begin to come back. So a character like Zerubbabel, he brings a group of them back to Judah, to Jerusalem, and he helps to rebuild the temple. Okay, that's pretty good. Then Ezra comes, and he begins to teach people the law so they can start to study the scriptures. Okay, so that's good. And then Nehemiah comes to kind of finish it up, and he helps to rebuild the wall. So as everyone's coming back, there's kind of a little bit of hope of optimism because things are going to be back to the good old days. Unfortunately, despite these things, they still are a puppet nation. They are under the rule of the Persian Empire. They're not their own sovereign nation anymore. The Persians rule over. And although it seems like the Persian kings are very kind to the Jews, they're still not their own nation. Okay, then comes another group of people, Alexander the Great and his nation. He defeats the Persians, and he comes into Judah, bringing all of his culture and names and religion with him. Now, he dies actually younger than me, so by the time he was my age, he'd conquered most of the known world. And his nation is broken up into 3 or 4 smaller countries that are always going at it. Always going at it. You'll see a little bit of this, glimpses of this in the Old Testament. So these 3 countries break up, but for the Jewish people, they are facing a cultural change. So for as long as their history has been, they have been the main people in the land. They've decided what the religion is, what the culture is, and now there's this outside foreign Greek culture being brought into their land. The term is Hellenization, It's this idea of the Jewish culture being changed into Greek culture. So the Greeks are bringing their gods, their culture, all of this stuff. Then come the Romans. Their Romans are even more powerful. The Romans come in, drive the Greeks out, etc. And you have now this Roman culture being brought into the land. So the Jewish people have to respond. This new culture is being brought in. They're bringing their gods, their culture, their ways of doing things. How are we going to respond to this? Fair enough. So they respond in different ways, and that is what gives us the different groups that we see in the New Testament. So some people, like the Zealots, their goal is we're going to fight back. You stuck us, we're going to give it to you in return. Violence, could call them terrorists, freedom fighters. Then you have the one group that's kind of neat, the Sicarii, which is like a group of assassins, which I think is kind of neat. They're these are bad guys. Actually, the Chosen series, I think, portrays Simon, one of Jesus' disciples, as being one of these characters. But their goal is they view this outside culture as evil, wicked, and we're going to fight back with violence, and we're going to be violent to you if we see you collaborating with them. So that's one group. Then you have another group called the Essenes, who these people are kind of a little bit more mysterious, but essentially they were like, this is a waste of time. I'm out of here. I'm going to go live in the desert and study Torah by myself alone and wait for the Messiah. So you have the other extreme. You have the people who are like, we're going to give it to him, we're going to fight back. And then the other team who they're like, this is a waste of time. We've been beat. Let's just run away and wait for our Savior to come back. So those are your two extremes. But then closer to the middle, you have your Sadducees, Herodians. These are words that you'll see in the New Testament in Acts. These folks viewed this influx of Greek Roman culture as a way to make money. So a lot of them were very favorable to the Greek culture. So they were very pro-Rome, pro their ways of doing things. Tax collectors weren't so much of a group, but it was a similar idea of these people are viewing the Romans and this way of life as a way to make money. They would have been strongly disliked and hated by their counterparts on the other side, the Pharisees. The Pharisees, we always give them a bad rap, fair enough, but their name means separators, those who separate. And their goal was, that's bad, we don't like that, that's coming in and changing everything that we want to do, so we need to maintain rigorous study of the Old Testament, of their scriptures, rigorous pursuance of holiness, rigorous seeking to follow what the law says, what their Jewish law says. So the Pharisees and the Sadducees have very different ways of looking at the world around them. The Pharisees do get a negative rap, but Jesus, something that my sister brought up to me while I was talking about this, Jesus was probably closest to the Pharisees. Of all of these different groups, in Matthew 23, he tells the people, hey guys, listen to what the Pharisees say and obey them. Just don't do what they do. So it's the first use of do as I say, not as I do. But he was telling people, hey, the things that the Pharisees are telling you to do them, just don't do what they are doing. And I think there's maybe an honorableness that sometimes we can miss with these folks, in that we talk about them adding rules to Scripture. Okay, this wasn't just for the fun of it. Their goal was, if I want to pursue holiness, then I want to distance myself as far as I can from doing anything wrong. So if the law, if the moral line is here, then I'm going to make a bunch of walls that stand between me and that moral line so that I can't possibly do wrong. If you're on a diet, okay, and let's say gummies are your weakness. Not speaking for anyone in here. But let's just say, just arbitrarily, gummies are your weakness. I've heard people say, we are just getting rid of sugar completely out of the house. Is there something wrong with you eating sugar? No, but you know that if I'm not eating sugar, then I definitely can't fall into the trap of eating gummies. So when we look at these different groups, because we're going to talk about the Pharisees primarily, I want to set the stage that these people aren't just these bad, evil villains that just hate everybody. These are people that are responding to the culture as they think is right, and they're seeking to be holy, to obey the God that they have been given. Then we have this character named Jesus show up. So, let's open to Matthew chapter 9. If you're using the Pew Bibles, that will be on page 965. Matthew chapter 9. And we're going to look at verses 9 through 13 in a moment. Right before this point, at the beginning of chapter 9, Jesus has seen a paralytic, and he heals the man, but before he heals him, he forgives his sins. And the religious people who see that, they fall apart because who can forgive sins except for God? Which is a good point. And then he continues on from there, and that brings him to this point. So, verse 9, as Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting in the tax collector's booth. And he said to him, "Follow me," and he got up and followed him. So, we're talking about these groups. Matthew is a tax collector. So when you think tax collector, don't think like evil, villain, horrible guy. This is a guy who his job is to make money for the oppressor. So you've got an occupying force in your country, troops all around, taxing you, and Matthew is helping them. But Jesus calls him and says, "Matthew, I want you on my team to be one of my guys." It's interesting, Jesus also calls Simon, who is another character that we see in The Chosen, who is a zealot. So you've got a collaborator and a terrorist, assassin, whatever word you want to use, on the same team following Jesus. And he wants both of these guys to imitate him. Then it happened that as Jesus was reclining at the table in the house, behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and were dining with Jesus and his disciples. So Jesus is sitting at this house. He's got his followers with him, and these tax collectors and sinners are coming and eating with him. So these people are coming to him with his disciples. And who knows how much they knew about this guy at this point? Who knows what he was talking to them about at this point? But he's having dinner, and all of these people are coming to him. So, verse 11. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, "Why is your teacher eating with the tax collectors and sinners?" Okay. That's, I think, a legitimate question if we think of them as their name is "we who separate." So, hey, Jesus, we are trying so hard to separate from the world, separate from filthiness, separate from the filthy people. Why are you hanging out with them? Why are you eating with them? I think that's a question that we can understand from their perspective. Jesus' answer is awesome. Look at the next few verses. When Jesus heard this, he said, "It is not those who are healthy who need a physician, but those who are sick. Go learn what this means. I desire compassion, not sacrifice. For I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners." So Jesus says a couple things. First, he says, hey, I'm here to heal the sick. I'm the physician, and I've got the answer that these people need. I'm not here to heal the people who are healthy. I'm here to heal the people who need help. Which is true. He did have the answer. He's also going to say, I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. And we'll see in a moment this idea of righteousness from the religious leaders. But right in the middle of that, he says, go and learn what this means. I desire compassion, not sacrifice. So, this is a quote from Hosea chapter 6. You can turn there if you like. You do not have to. I'm just going to spend just a moment. But let's see what he is referencing here. I'm going to read verses 4 through 6 just to give us a few verses of context to this short passage. What shall I do with you, O Ephraim? Ephraim being a name for the northern kingdom of Israel. What shall I do with you, O Judah? For your loyalty is like a morning cloud, and like the dew which goes away. Therefore I have hewn them in pieces by the prophets. I have slain them by the words of my mouth, and the judgments on you are like the light that goes forth. For I delight in loyalty rather than sacrifice, and in the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. So I delight in loyalty rather than sacrifice, and the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. So what is this prophet, what issue is this prophet addressing? Because I think this is important. Throughout the Old Testament, the prophets will hammer an issue in the Jewish people over and over and over and over again. Guys, I see what you're doing. You're doing your sacrifices, your rituals, but your heart's not in it. You are obeying all of the rules. You're doing all the things that I've asked you, but I can tell that you're just doing it because you have to do it, and you don't actually care about me. I would rather have your loyalty rather than these sacrifices. If you messed up all of the sacrifices, but your heart was fully with me, then I would be on board. Probably didn't say it that way. Think about David. So King David is one of the main characters in the Old Testament. He is the king that is all other kings are compared to. All other kings fall short to David as morally. David does a lot of really, really bad stuff. He's a murderer, adulterer. He does a lot of terrible, terrible things that probably would put him in prison today. But his heart was always for the God of Israel. Right? He never, unlike every other king, I assume, every other king turns to other gods at different points, but David never does. David's heart is true from beginning to end. And God says, David, you've messed up a ton. You've done some really, really bad things, but I can tell that you love me. And so the prophet here is saying, I would rather have you be loyal. The word is chesed. I think Mark has brought this word up. Faithfulness, steadfast love. I would rather have your loyalty than all of these sacrifices, but with you guys, it's the other way around. You're doing all of the things, and I can tell that I don't have your loyalty. So let's go back to Matthew. Jesus says, go and learn what this means. I desired compassion and not sacrifice. Now, I did actually look this up, and the word that he's using is not just another word that we've translated compassion instead of loyalty. It's the word compassion. So for some reason, Jesus is choosing to use a slightly different word in his quote here. But I think this is what Jesus is saying. He's speaking to these people. Guys, you are doing all of the things so well. As far as the law, you are blameless. And we'll see a Pharisee will share his doings in a moment. You guys are doing your sacrifices, you are tithing, you are faithful to your wives, you give to people who need it. But you look at these people and you don't want to have anything to do with them. These people have made a mess of their lives, probably, but they're all over me. They can't get enough. They're following me around because they know that I am the answer. Do you see the differences between the religious leaders here and the people that are around Jesus? And let's consider and contrast the attitudes that the Pharisees have with the Pharisees and Jesus to those people. The Pharisees viewed those people as dirty. I need to stay away from those people. I need to stay away from them, separate myself, because they're bad people. Jesus views them and says, hey, I've got the answer. I need to be running to them and bring them around me so that I can impact them. Because I've got the answer. And he did. He did have the answer, as do we. So let's look at a parable to compare and contrast to this passage. Go to Luke chapter 18. Luke chapter 18 has one of my favorite parables. It's going to compare and contrast two characters. This is one that is regularly convicting to me because so often I can see these attitudes that we'll see in a moment in myself. Okay. So we know who the Pharisees are. We know who the tax collectors are. Let's see how they view themselves. Verse 9. And he also told this parable to some people who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and viewed others with contempt. So, at the end in Matthew, verse 13, Jesus said, I've come to call sinners, not the righteous, or something like that. So here, he sees that those people who he considers righteous are those who trusted in themselves that they were righteous, and then they view others with contempt. So, two men went up into the temple to pray. One was a Pharisee, the other was a tax collector. We have these contrasting views, ways of doing things, etc. So the Pharisee stood and was praying this to himself: God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, swindlers, unjust, adulterers, or even this tax collector. I fast twice a week and I pay tithes of all that I get. So this is the Pharisee's prayer. Now, was he doing all of these things? Probably, yeah. I have no reason to think that he's just full of it. I think he's most certainly is doing all of these things. Paul will talk about all the things that he did. So, again, we look at the Pharisees sometimes as the bad guys, and they end up being the bad guys. But I also want us to see that this guy is a guy that is trying to do the honorable thing. Right? It is honorable not to be a swindler. It is honorable to be faithful to your spouse. It is honorable to be giving. And he does all of these things, but he can't help himself. He can't help himself. I thank you, God, that I'm not like other people. God, I thank you I'm not like this tax collector. He has the same attitude in his prayer as the other Pharisees had towards the people that Jesus was eating with. So he's so close. Like, he has the desire to follow God, to obey him, to put to death whatever in his flesh needs to be put to death. But his attitude is, man, I'm awesome, and these people don't measure up to my standards. Now let's look at the tax collector and his prayer. The tax collector, standing some distance away, was even unwilling to lift up his eyes to heaven, but was beating his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, the sinner. God, be merciful to me, the sinner. The tax collector's prayer is incredibly humble. And I want to ask just offhand, have you all been brought to that point? God, I don't deserve your time. I don't deserve anything from you. Would you be merciful to me? Because I think that's the start of the gospel. It's an admission that, no, I don't have the answer. I can't do this. But I think the tax collector is also seeing things incorrectly. Because notice that he stands afar off. He stands far off. There we go. And he won't even make eye contact with heaven. He's looking down, and he won't approach the temple because he's afraid, maybe? Because he's ashamed of himself? I have been this person many times, but I've also seen it where you have a group of people and somebody who's maybe not as cool or confident as the rest of the group enters the scene. And I've seen how they're looking around, trying not to make eye contact with anybody because they're afraid of what the people will think. They're afraid to approach the group because they're afraid of being rejected. I've seen that so many times. And the tax collector is doing the same thing. He's standing far away. He won't look up to heaven because the God that he has learned of from this Pharisee is a God that doesn't want to have anything to do with me. Is it true that he is a sinner? Yeah. Is it true that he's helping the occupying force, the Romans? Yes. But he views God as somebody that has, hey, stay away. Don't look at me. Keep your distance. Because that's what he's seen the Pharisees do to him. His relationship with God is not a relationship of, wow, I'm so excited I get to go talk to my Savior. It's, oh, I hope he'll just give me a couple extra days without zapping me. See, there's a difference there. Notice Jesus' conclusion, and I think we miss this conclusion because we've heard Pharisees bad, tax collectors good since the time we're born. But Jesus says, I tell you, it is this man who went to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but he who humbles himself will be exalted. So, you have those two characters. Pharisees, the tax collector. Let's tie this all together. We think about these two stories. Last week in youth group we talked briefly about narrative, that when stories are there, they're not just there for the fun of it, they're there to teach you something. So when an author puts a story, they're including details there because they want to communicate something to you. So we have a parable, which is like a story within a story, and we have Jesus and the Pharisees and the tax collectors. We have all of this going on. Think about how the tax collectors, the sinners, the people of the land, that was a term that the religious leaders had for those who weren't studying the law as rigorously as them, the people of the law, of the land. Think about how the people responded to the two versions of God that they saw. The God that we see in Luke 18, the God that the tax collector saw from the Pharisee, this is the God that wanted to keep him at arm's length. Hey, you are dirty and a mess, and you need to stay out there, and you better look down. The God that people saw in Jesus, I don't really know how much they would have known at this point, but what they did know was this guy's a teacher of the law, and he wants to eat dinner with me. He wants to hang out with me. And the response is electric. Jesus spends his entire ministry with people all over him, people following him wherever he goes, even to the point where he is exhausted. It's the same people. But when they saw when around the Pharisees, that gave them fear and shame. Man, I can't approach God. God doesn't want to have anything to do with me. But when they saw Jesus, they were pursuing him utterly. Now, let's bring this to us. We live in the same world today that Jesus and his disciples lived then. We live in a world that is filled with brokenness, with hurting, a world that is filled with tax collectors and sinners. I want to come back to that guy's prayer. Have you been brought to a place, Lord, I need you. I can't do this. Not, I've gone to church, I've done the things. Have you been brought to a place where, Lord, you have the answer. I'm trying to figure things out myself, and it's not working. That is the beginning and probably the most important step of the gospel. Let me ask another question. What is the God that people see in you? So when people look at our lives, what do our lives teach us about God's character? Are we people that when people look at us, they say, man, I couldn't measure up to that? Are we people that when people see us, they'd be like, man, that is the person that I want to hang out around? That is a person that, because I don't understand everything that they're doing with the church stuff, but if they're worshiping a God and he's made them like that, then I want to worship that same God. The Pharisees were defined by their separation from sin, from wickedness, all of those things, but also their separation from those people. Because of that, they missed out on all of those people that were around them. Whenever I read historical settings, there's always a little piece of myself that's kind of a kid, and I wish I could go back in time, and wish I could go to a lot of different places. But go back in time and tell the Pharisees, guys, you're so close. Theologically, you and Jesus are like maybe right there. But they didn't. Maybe it was because of envy. Maybe they saw Jesus and they're like, guys. Jesus is doing everything that we want to do. We want people to come to our God, and people are flocking to Jesus. They're not flocking to us. He must be the bad guy. Unfortunately, they don't change their ways, and all of these different Jewish groups don't change their ways, and the conflict with this Greek-Roman culture only gets worse until 40 years later, the weight of that culture comes with an army, and everything that these Jewish groups were trying to do is obliterated, destroyed, and the world that they knew it is gone, changed. Wonder how different it would have been had they not have responded that way. So, we are going to close with the Lord's Supper in a moment. We'll have the kids coming up in 6 minutes. Some questions to think. If you are like the tax collector, and you've been brought to a place of, Lord, I can't do this. I'm trying to do life as well as I can, and it just doesn't work. You are the one that Jesus has come for. Jesus doesn't think, man, you haven't gone to church long enough. You haven't gotten your life together fast enough. No. If you're there saying, be merciful to me, a sinner, then he wants you. Well, let's ask the rest of us the second question. And this is the one that has been convicting to me all this week. I've had to confess some things to some people. Do you have those people in your life? The people that you are supposed to stay away from, that you don't want your friends talking to, being around. People that you want to separate from. I think we all have them. Now, does our interaction with those people mirror the interaction that Christ had with them? Or does that mirror the interaction that the Pharisees had with them? This requires self-examination. It's easy to minister to those of you who are already in here, because we're all basically doing the same thing in similar spots. That makes ministry easy. I can talk about the Word of God with person X because they're already going to my church. What about the person who is very different? Maybe whose life is a lot messier than yours. You have the same desire to minister to them as to the church person next to you. In a moment, the gentleman will come forward. And I just want to remind us, when we take the bread and the cup, what are we saying? First, we have the bread. That this represents Jesus' body. That Jesus came here and he said, guys, this piece of bread that I'm breaking, he wasn't holding a little piece. This represents my body that I am giving for you. Jesus died so that we could have our sins forgiven, so that we could have a relationship with him. And then with the cup, the juice, this is the blood of the covenant. When we take the juice, this is a reminder that Jesus' blood sealed us into a relationship with God. So if you have a relationship with Jesus this morning, and you go home and you mess up badly, that blood holds you. That relationship with Jesus is not broken. That you and I, we may fall short. We may choose to do the wrong thing, to go the wrong direction, but he will not let us go. So, I'm going to have the gentleman come forward, and while they do, I want you to examine yourselves. Have you been brought to a place of, Lord, I need you? Do you have the same attitude towards the people around you that Jesus did.